artillery plotting board sat on a folding table in the firebase command bunker at Nui Dat, marked with grease pencil coordinates that would become famous in Australian military history. Grid reference 486655. Someone had drawn a small circle around those numbers. Inside that circle were the positions of 108 men. The fire mission called for high explosive shells to land 50 meters from that circle. 50 meters. Any artillery officer looking at that plotting board would immediately recognize what those numbers meant. That was not a fire support mission. That was a death sentence written in military shorthand. The grease pencil marks are gone now, wiped away decades ago, but the mathematics they represented remain. 50 meters from a 105mm howitzer shell means you are inside the kill radius. It means fragments of hot steel will be traveling through the air where human bodies are standing. It means the overpressure wave will compress lungs and rupture eardrums. It means someone calculated that dying from your own artillery was preferable to what was coming through the rubber trees. August 18th, 1966. Phuoc Thai Province, South Vietnam. 3 separate forces were moving toward collision that morning. Each operated under different assumptions. Each followed different orders. Each believed they understood what the day would bring. By sunset, all 3 would be proven catastrophically wrong. The first force was D Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment. 108 professional soldiers who had volunteered for this war. They woke at 05:30 hours to the smell of breakfast being prepared in the mess tent at Nui Dat base. Powdered eggs reconstituted with water. Toast made from bread shipped from Saigon. Tea brewed strong enough to strip paint. Men sat on wooden benches in the pre-dawn darkness making the kind of conversation soldiers make before patrols. Someone complained about a letter from home that had taken 3 weeks to arrive. Another talked about a card game from the previous night. A private mentioned he had short-timer's disease, only 40 days left in country. His friends told him not to talk about it because that was bad luck. Nobody mentioned the mortar attack from the night before. The Viet Cong had shelled Nui Dat with 8 rounds of 82mm mortar fire. Minor damage. No casualties. Standard harassment. The kind of thing that happened so regularly it barely rated discussion. The mortars had been firing from somewhere east of the base. Probably from the Long Tan rubber plantation. D Company would sweep that area today. Find the firing positions, destroy any equipment left behind. Routine work. Major Harry Smith ate breakfast with his company headquarters staff. He was 33 years old, medium height, lean from the tropical climate and irregular meals. Before the army he had taught at a secondary school in Sydney. Mathematics and history. He had joined the military in 1951 and discovered he was good at the kind of problem-solving that kept men alive. His soldiers respected him because he never raised his voice and never made stupid decisions. In an army where officers often had one quality or the other, but rarely both, Smith was unusual. He studied the patrol order over tea that had gone cold. The mission area was the Long Tan plantation, a commercial rubber operation planted by French colonists in the 1920s. The trees grew in perfect geometric rows 20 meters apart. Flat terrain. Good visibility. The kind of environment where infantry could move easily and see threats before they became dangerous. Intelligence assessment suggested minimal enemy presence. The Viet Cong mortar teams had almost certainly withdrawn after their attack. This would be a walk through empty jungle. Find some abandoned equipment, maybe capture a straggler. Be back before the evening meal. Smith signed the order and passed it to his operations sergeant. He did not feel confident about the intelligence assessment, but he also did not have better information. War is fought with imperfect knowledge. You make decisions based on what you think is true, and you accept that sometimes you will be wrong. The second force was already in position. The commander of the Viet Cong's 275th Regiment had been planning this operation for 3 weeks. He was a professional soldier who had fought the French in the early 1950s and had been fighting the Americans and their allies since. His tactical education came from the Chinese military academy and from years of surviving in hostile terrain. He understood that battles are won before the first shot is fired, through positioning and patience and exploiting the enemy's assumptions. His regiment consisted of 3 battalions, approximately 2,500 soldiers. They had infiltrated into the Long Tan area over the course of a week, moving at night, hiding during the day, bringing weapons and ammunition forward through trails that did not appear on any Allied maps. The mortar attack on Nui Dat had been deliberate provocation. He knew the Australians would send a patrol to investigate. He knew they would send company strength because that was their standard operating procedure. He knew exactly where they would walk and exactly how he would destroy them. The plan was simple and had worked against French colonial forces a decade earlier. Position battalions in a horseshoe formation. Let the enemy patrol enter the kill zone. Hit them from 3 sides simultaneously. Overwhelm them with mass and violence before they could call for reinforcements or artillery support. Accept that his regiment would take casualties. Victory always required blood. The question was whose blood and how much. His soldiers were in position by dawn. They had dug shallow fighting positions overnight, camouflaged with cut vegetation. They had placed machine guns to create overlapping fields of fire. They had positioned mortar teams in defilade where they could not be seen from ground level. They had done everything correctly. Now they waited. The third force existed only on paper and in the minds of staff officers at Task Force headquarters. Lieutenant Colonel Colin Townsend commanded the 1st Australian Task Force. He was in his office at 0800 hours reviewing status reports and intelligence summaries. The war in Phuoc Thai province was proceeding according to plan. Australian units were conducting aggressive patrolling. Viet Cong activity was down compared to the previous month. Civilian cooperation was improving in some villages. The numbers looked good. Townsend had Alpha Company in reserve at Nui Dat, resting after a week-long operation in the north. They were available if needed, but Townsend did not expect to need them. D Company's patrol was routine. If they made contact with anything significant, they would call for artillery support and withdraw. Standard doctrine. He had confidence in Major Smith's judgment. Smith would not take unnecessary risks. What Townsend did not know, what his intelligence officers did not know, was that 3 Viet Cong battalions were currently occupying the same ground where D Company would be patrolling in 2 hours. The intelligence assessment was not wrong due to negligence. It was wrong because the enemy had moved in absolute silence, in darkness, through terrain the Australians believed they controlled. Sometimes perfect operational security defeats even competent intelligence gathering. By 0900 hours, these 3 forces were moving toward contact. D Company assembled at the perimeter wire. 3 platoons plus headquarters element. Lieutenant Geoff Kendall's 11 platoon would take point. 28 men carrying SLAR rifles, M60 machine guns, grenades, radios. Lieutenant Dave Sabin's 10 platoon would follow at 200-meter interval. Lieutenant Geoff Kendall's 12 platoon would bring up the rear as reserve. Smith positioned himself with the headquarters group in the middle of the formation where he could control the company and communicate with all elements. The morning was already hot. Temperature climbing toward 40 degrees Celsius. Humidity thick enough to make breathing feel like work. Men adjusted their loads, tightened straps, checked weapons. The ritual movements of infantry preparing to patrol. Some had done this dozens of times. A few were on their first operation outside the wire. The experienced soldiers could identify the new ones by how they held their rifles and how their eyes moved. The new men gripped their weapons too tightly and looked at everything. The veterans held their rifles casually and looked at nothing specific, trusting their peripheral vision to catch movement. D Company crossed the wire at 1000 hours and entered the scrub brush east of Nui Dat. The ground was soft from recent rain. Boot prints sank into mud. The smell was organic decay mixed with the sharp chemical scent of insect repellent and the metallic tang of gun oil. Birds called from the trees. Insects buzzed. The jungle was loud with life, which was generally a good sign, because animals went quiet when humans were near. Kendall led 11 platoon through the scrub and into the edge of the rubber plantation. The transition was sharp. Wild jungle gave way to ordered rows of trees. The ground beneath the rubber was cleared of undergrowth, maintained by workers who tapped the trees for latex. Visibility increased dramatically. You could see hundreds of meters down the aisles between tree rows. Kendall kept his men in tactical formation anyway. Good visibility works both ways. Behind 11 platoon, 10 platoon maintained their interval. Saban had his men moving in bounds, one section advancing while another covered. Professional infantry work learned in training and refined through repetition. The men were sweating heavily now. Uniforms were darkening with moisture. Canteens were coming out regularly. Water discipline was important, but so was hydration. Men had passed out from heat stroke on patrols before. Smith monitored radio traffic while moving with his headquarters group. Kendall was reporting his position every 15 minutes. Nothing unusual observed, no signs of enemy activity. The patrol was proceeding exactly as planned. Smith allowed himself to think this might actually be a routine day. Rain started at 1300 hours. The sky did not darken gradually. One moment it was clear blue with scattered clouds. The next moment it was black, and water was falling in vertical rivers. Monsoon rain in Southeast Asia does not build. It arrives. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in as many seconds. Visibility collapsed from hundreds of meters to barely 20. The sound was overwhelming, a continuous roar that made radio communication difficult and verbal communication impossible. Kendall signaled his platoon to slow, but not stop. They kept moving through the downpour. Water ran off helmets and down necks. Uniforms became sodden. Boots began slipping in mud that was forming beneath the rubber trees. Every step required attention. Men focused on the ground immediately in front of them, not on the grey curtain of rain surrounding them. Which is why they almost walked past the Viet Cong patrol. Kendall saw movement at the edge of his vision, dark shapes between trees. He raised his fist and his platoon froze. He stared through the rain trying to identify what he was seeing. Could be civilians, could be friendly forces, could be enemy. The shapes were maybe 50 meters away, indistinct in the downpour. Then one of the shapes raised a weapon. Kendall made his decision in half a second. He gave the fire order with a hand signal. 11 platoon opened fire. The SLAR rifles cracked out measured bursts. The shapes scattered. Some went down. Others returned fire with the distinctive rattle of AK-47s. The contact was sharp and brief. The Viet Cong pulled back into the rubber plantation. Kendall got on the radio to company headquarters. His voice was calm but urgent. Contact with enemy patrol. Approximately 30 individuals. They are withdrawing east, requesting permission to pursue. Smith acknowledged immediately. Permission granted. 10 platoon moving forward to support. This was textbook infantry tactics. Make contact. Fix the enemy with fire. Bring up reinforcements. Destroy them. Smith had done this before. Kendall had done this before. Every man in D Company had trained for exactly this scenario. What they did not know was that those 30 men were not an isolated patrol. They were a screening element, covering the deployment of an entire regiment. And that regiment was not withdrawing. It was attacking. The second contact came less than 3 minutes after the first. This time it was not 30 men. It was hundreds. They emerged from the grey rain like a human flood, firing from multiple directions, throwing grenades, advancing in waves that absorbed casualties and kept coming. Kendall's voice came over the radio with a different tone. Enemy in battalion strength. Taking fire from east and north. Request immediate reinforcement. Smith felt his stomach drop. Battalion strength meant at least 300 enemy soldiers. Kendall had 28 men. The mathematics were impossible. He gave orders rapidly. 10 platoon, double time to 11 platoon's position. 12 platoon, prepare to move. Company mortars, fire on suspected enemy positions. Artillery forward observer, get me fire support from Nui Dat immediately. The tactical situation was deteriorating with terrifying speed. Kendall's men were fighting from behind rubber trees that provided almost no cover. The trees were too thin. Bullets punched through bark and kept going. Splinters became projectiles. Men were taking wounds from their own cover, fragmenting under enemy fire. The Viet Cong were using classic human wave tactics. They advanced in groups of 20 or 30, firing as they moved. When one group took casualties and went to ground, another group advanced through them. Continuous forward pressure. Overwhelming momentum. Private Michael McCarthy crouched behind a rubber tree, feeling bark chips rain down on his helmet. He was 19 years old, from Brisbane, on his second patrol outside the wire. His section leader was shouting orders, but McCarthy could barely hear over the rain and gunfire. He fired controlled bursts at movement in the trees. He had no idea if he was hitting anything. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere, shapes appearing and disappearing in the grey rain. He reloaded his rifle with hands that were shaking badly. The magazine slipped and he nearly dropped it. He recovered, seated it, charged his weapon, and resumed firing. To his left, another private took an AK round through the shoulder. The man spun and went down hard. McCarthy wanted to help, but his section leader was screaming at him to keep firing. The wounded man crawled behind the tree line. Someone else would have to help him. McCarthy kept shooting. 10 platoon arrived on 11 platoon's left flank at 14:30 hours. Sabin deployed his sections and immediately engaged the enemy. The firepower doubled. The Viet Cong assault paused. For perhaps 2 minutes it looked like the Australians might stabilize the situation. Then the third wave hit and the pause evaporated. This was not a battalion. This was a regiment. Over 1,000 soldiers were flowing through the rubber plantation like water finding paths through stone. They came from the east in company strength. They pushed up from the south in platoon-sized elements. They were trying to envelope the Australian flanks and surround them completely. The horseshoe formation was closing. Smith made the decision that would define the battle. They would not withdraw. Withdrawal while in contact with enemy forces was how units got destroyed. Men ran, and the enemy chased them and shot them in the back. D Company would hold ground and fight from a defensive position. He ordered 12 platoon to move left and extend the line. He positioned his headquarters in a shallow depression that provided minimal defilade. He got his 2-inch mortars working, dropping high explosive rounds at enemy concentrations. Then he grabbed his artillery forward observer. The forward observer was a young lieutenant who had been with the company for 6 weeks. He was competent, but inexperienced. Smith gave him target coordinates 500 meters east of their position. The lieutenant called the fire mission to the New Zealand artillery battery at Nui Dat. The battery acknowledged. Within 3 minutes, shells were landing in the rubber plantation. The ground shook. Trees shattered. Orange fireballs erupted through the grey rain. The Viet Cong took casualties, but 500 meters was too far. The enemy was closer than that. They were inside that radius, and they were still advancing. Smith adjusted. 400 meters. The artillery shifted. Still too far. 300 meters. Getting closer, but not close enough. Men were dying while Smith walked fire toward his own position, trying to find the precise distance that would kill the enemy without killing his own soldiers. The radio traffic between platoon commanders and Smith became increasingly desperate. Kendall reported 11 platoon had taken 50% casualties. Half his men were dead or wounded. They were running low on ammunition. Some soldiers were down to their last magazine. If the enemy attacked again in strength, they could not hold. Sabin reported 10 platoon was in similar condition. They had perhaps 30 rounds per man remaining. The M60 machine gunner had been hit. The gun was still functioning, but the replacement gunner was not trained and was firing in long bursts that would burn out the barrel. Smith looked at his watch. 1450 hours. They had been fighting for less than an hour. It felt like days. Time was doing strange things. Individual seconds stretched while entire minutes compressed into instants. He made another adjustment to the artillery. 200 meters. The battery commander at Nui Dat questioned the order over the radio. 200 meters from friendly forces was danger close. That put Australian soldiers inside the fragmentation radius. Smith confirmed the order. 200 meters. Fire immediately. The shells landed and the ground jumped. The noise was not heard so much as felt in the chest cavity. A physical hammer blow of sound. Trees disintegrated. The Viet Cong took heavy casualties. The assault slowed. But slowing them was not enough. By 1500 hours, the tactical situation had become desperate. D Company was surrounded on 3 sides. The western side remained open, but that direction led back to Nui Dat through 4 kilometers of enemy-controlled territory. They could not run. Not with wounded. Not with the enemy in position to chase them down and destroy them piecemeal. Kendall's voice came over the radio. He spoke calmly, but the words were devastating. 11 platoon is combat ineffective. We have 17 men still able to fight. Maybe 20 rounds each. If they hit us again, we will be overrun. Request permission to withdraw to company headquarters. Smith granted permission immediately. Pull back now. Move fast. Kendall organized the withdrawal with the same calm professionalism he had shown throughout the battle. Wounded were carried by unwounded. They moved in bounds. They made it back to the company perimeter without losing anyone else. When they collapsed inside the defensive line, some men were sobbing. Not from fear, from exhaustion, from the simple overwhelming relief of still being alive when they should have been dead. The defensive perimeter was now a circle perhaps 60 meters across. Inside that circle were over 100 men, more than 40 of them wounded. The company medic was moving between casualties doing triage in the rain. Some he could treat. Others needed evacuation to the base hospital, or they would die. But evacuation was impossible. No helicopter could fly in this weather. Outside the perimeter, the Viet Cong were regrouping for another assault. Smith could see them through the rain, dark shapes moving between trees, officers shouting orders, soldiers fixing bayonets. They were preparing for a final push, a human wave attack that would overwhelm the Australians through sheer mass. Smith stood in the rain holding his radio handset. His uniform was caked with mud. Water ran down his face. Around him, men were bleeding into the mud. His mind was doing calculations. The Viet Cong had maybe 800 soldiers still in fighting condition. D Company had perhaps 60 men who could still fire weapons. The mathematics were impossible. But he had artillery. He called the battery commander at Nui Dat. His voice was steady. I need fire at 100 meters from my position. The battery commander refused. 100 meters is inside minimum safe distance. You will take casualties from our own fire." Smith looked at the enemy massing for assault. "I understand the risk. Fire the mission." The battery commander refused again. "I cannot authorize fire that close to friendly forces. It violates doctrine." Smith took a breath. He wiped rain from his eyes. He made the decision that would save his company or kill them all. "I am giving you a direct order. Fire at 50 meters from my position. I take full personal responsibility for any friendly casualties. If Australian soldiers die from this artillery, that responsibility falls on me. Now fire the goddamn mission." There was silence on the radio. 5 seconds that felt eternal. Then the battery commander's voice came back. "Shot out. Shells incoming." Smith did not tell his men to take cover. They already knew. Every soldier in D Company pressed themselves into the mud. They got behind trees. They covered their heads with their arms. Some men prayed to gods they had not thought about in years. Others just waited with their eyes closed. The shells arrived. The first explosion was not sound. It was a physical force that compressed the air and stopped lungs from functioning. The blast wave rolled over the Australian positions like an invisible wall. Heat could be felt. Shrapnel screamed overhead. Trees exploded. The ground erupted in geysers of mud, and the Viet Cong assault wave ceased to exist. Bodies were thrown through the air. Men were blown apart. The soldiers who survived the initial blast were hit by flying debris. The ones who tried to run were cut down by shrapnel that spread in a cone covering hundreds of square meters. In 30 seconds, an entire enemy company was eliminated. But the Australians paid a price. 2 men in 10 platoon were wounded by their own artillery. One took shrapnel in the leg. Another had his eardrums ruptured by overpressure. They were casualties from friendly fire. They were also alive. Smith called for the barrage to continue. He walked shells around the Australian position in a protective arc. He requested white phosphorus to mark enemy positions and create smoke screens. He coordinated with the battery commander, who now understood what Smith was doing. This was not random destruction. This was using artillery to create a barrier the enemy could not cross. For the next hour, shells fell continuously. The noise merged into a single ongoing detonation. The rubber plantation was being systematically destroyed. Craters pitted the ground, trees were reduced to splinters, and the Viet Cong were dying by the hundreds. Their commander finally accepted reality. The assault had failed. Casualties were catastrophic. He ordered withdrawal. But D Company was not saved yet. They were still surrounded, still low on ammunition, still had 40 casualties that needed evacuation, and help was 4 kilometers away through enemy territory. Lieutenant Colonel Townsend at Nui Dat had been monitoring the radio traffic all afternoon. He had heard Smith's increasingly desperate situation reports. He had listened to the artillery fire missions getting closer and closer to friendly positions. He knew D Company was dying. At 16:30 hours, he made his decision. Alpha Company would mount up in armored personnel carriers and fight their way to Long Tan. He gave the order personally. "Get our men." 13 APCs loaded with infantry began rolling east. They took fire from all directions. RPGs bounced off armor plate. Machine gun rounds ricocheted off steel hulls. The vehicles kept rolling. Inside, soldiers gripped their rifles and waited for the moment when the rear ramps would drop, and they would have to fight their way into the battle. At 1700 hours, the first act broke through to D Company's position. The relief was overwhelming. Fresh troops poured out. Ammunition was distributed. Wounded were loaded onto vehicles. For the first time in 3 hours, the Australians had reinforcements. The Viet Cong recognized they had lost their advantage. They began withdrawing in good order. They carried their wounded. They collected weapons from their dead. They faded back into the jungle with the discipline of professional soldiers who knew when to break contact. By 1800 hours, the Battle of Long Tan was over. Recovery teams moved through the plantation after dark. They counted Australian casualties. 18 dead, 24 wounded. Nearly 40% of D Company had been killed or wounded, but they had held their ground against a force that should have annihilated them. The Viet Cong left behind over 245 confirmed dead. Intelligence analysts estimated actual casualties were much higher because the enemy had carried away bodies during withdrawal. An entire regiment had been shattered. Major Harry Smith walked through his company position after the fighting ended. He moved from man to man, checking on soldiers. He did not give speeches. He did not try to explain what had happened. He simply made sure they knew he was still there, still in command, still responsible for the decisions that had killed 18 men and saved 90. Later that night, Smith sat alone in the command bunker writing after action reports. His hands were steady. His handwriting was clear. He documented the battle in precise military language, grid coordinates, casualty figures, artillery missions fired. The report was professional and unemotional. It did not mention fear or courage. It did not mention the moment when he had ordered fire to fall on his own position. It simply stated facts and results. But those who saw Smith that night said his eyes looked different. Older, carrying weight that had not been there that morning. The artillery battery at Nui Dat had fired over 3,000 rounds during the battle. The New Zealand gunners had worked their tubes past safe operating temperatures. They had fired missions that violated every safety regulation in the manual. They had done it because Australian soldiers were dying, and regulations mean nothing when lives are on the line. Years later, military analysts would study Smith's decisions at Long Tan. They would examine the artillery records. They would interview survivors. Their conclusions were unanimous. Smith's decision to call fire danger close was not just tactically sound. It was the only decision that could have worked. Any other choice would have resulted in D Company being destroyed. Modern artillery doctrine now includes Long Tan as a case study in danger close fire missions. Officers are taught that sometimes survival requires accepting risks that appear suicidal. That calculated gambling with lives is sometimes the only way to save those lives. That commanders must be willing to take full responsibility for decisions that could end in disaster. But doctrine and case studies cannot capture what it felt like to stand in the rain making that radio call, to calculate blast radiuses while men died around you, to order artillery to land on your own position knowing it might kill the soldiers you were trying to save. The Viet Cong never attempted another large-scale attack on Australian forces in Phuoc Thai province. They had learned at Long Tan that Australians could not be overwhelmed by numbers. They would hold their ground. They would call fire on their own positions, rather than surrender. The lesson was written in blood across a rubber plantation. Smith received the Military Cross for his actions at Long Tan. The citation mentioned his leadership under fire and his tactical skill. It mentioned his decision to call artillery danger close. It did not mention that he had been willing to die along with his men if that was what survival required. The men of D Company returned to routine after Long Tan. Patrols, guard duty, the same war they had been fighting before. But something had changed. Other soldiers looked at them differently. There was recognition that they had survived something extraordinary, a shared experience that could not be explained to anyone who had not been there. Some handled it better than others. Lieutenant Kendall left the army after his tour ended. He could not continue serving. The memories were too heavy. Other soldiers from D Company struggled with nightmares and flashbacks. Australia did not welcome home its Vietnam veterans the way it had welcomed soldiers from previous wars. There were no parades. The country was divided over the war. Veterans learned to hide their service. Decades later, survivors of Long Tan gather occasionally at reunions. They are old men now, in their 70s and 80s. They drink beer and tell stories. They laugh about things that were not funny at the time. They talk about the rain and the mud and the sound of shells landing close enough to feel. They do not talk much about courage or heroism. Those words seem inadequate. What they experienced went beyond simple definitions. They were boys who became men in 3 hours of continuous combat. They learned that war is noise and confusion and terror, that it is watching friends die and not having time to mourn, that it is surviving when you should have died, and never understanding why you were spared. The rubber plantation at Long Tan is quiet now. The trees have grown back. The craters have filled in. Vietnamese farmers work the land. Tourists visit occasionally, standing where the battle happened, trying to imagine what it was like. But imagination is insufficient. You cannot stand in comfortable silence and understand what it meant to stand in the rain while artillery fell on your position. The Australian government maintains a memorial there, a simple cross made of concrete. Names of the dead are inscribed on bronze plaques. Veterans return sometimes to remember. They stand in front of those names thinking about friends who never left Vietnam, thinking about the commander who made the hardest decision, thinking about the day when survival required cooling down fire on their own heads, a greased pencil mark on an artillery plotting board. Grid reference 486655. 50 meters. Inside the kill radius. Someone calculated that dying from your own shells was better than what was coming. Someone made that calculation and then lived with it for the rest of his life. The mathematics of that decision survive in military textbooks and after-action reports, and in the memories of 90 men who should have died, but did not.